Well, thanks for having me. My name is Jillian Gilbert, and I am an assistant professor in the School of Business and Management. And I've been actually around APU since the early 2000s. I'm also an alum of APU. My parents met here, got married here, so lots of APU in my blood. And so it's really fun to get to come back and talk about the generations and this subject matter. Like Mike said, we talked about this early on, and it's becoming even more relevant as I even think about this year and reflect on my own teaching experiences this last year. I'm seeing a lot of shift, and so I'm really excited that we can talk about it. But before I do that, I want to introduce two really important people, Lacey Polvey and Gabriela Gutierrez. She goes by Gabby. These are actually former grad students of mine. They just graduated with their Master of Arts in Management in the Young Executive Program. And they are now some of my closest friends. And we love to sit and talk and research together. And I asked them, given that they are actually millennials, I asked them to come because it helps to hear from a millennial what's going on with their generation. But also because they are dynamic in their thoughts, they're critical thinkers. They have had a lot of applied projects that have enabled them to be able to speak with expertise. And so I'm thrilled that they're going to come. So we're actually going to share this presentation between the three of us. So you'll get to hear from them and also ask questions at the end from them directly. So I just wanted to introduce them. So thank you guys for coming. Okay, so basically, this has been a self-reflective journey for me. I don't know if you have those moments in your teaching experiences where what used to work is just not working anymore, or all of a sudden you find yourself saying, what happened? You know, all of a sudden students aren't reacting the same way. And with technology and all of these things that are coming, all of a sudden we find ourselves in a quandary. And I don't know, I've been teaching since 2004, and so I had a little bit of a mini crisis probably a few years ago because I realized I have to throw everything out. I felt like I had to throw everything out. What is going on? And I started to take a journey last year of really taking a risk and trying some new things and engaging students differently, and I found that the response was very transformative, probably more for me than it was for the students. But so then we talked with Mike, and then all of this started to come together. So this presentation is a culmination of some of a personal journey, but also what we're seeing are patterns. The other thing I want to set the tone for is that the way we compile the information here is through futuring and foresight. Has anybody heard those words before? Tom, anybody else? No, okay. So futuring and foresight is actually an area of discipline, and it's something that we can do, but we do it through non-traditional methods. So futuring and foresight usually looks 10 plus years out. So we're not looking at the immediate. It's not a reactive environment. It's very far out there, proactive, even catching things before they hit mainstream. So the way we looked and approached this subject matter was to look farther out, 10 plus years out, and say, what are we noticing to be trends and patterns that are starting to emerge on the very low levels that haven't bubbled up yet? And how is that impacting, and how could that impact education? And though millennials have been around for a long time, this Generation Z is literally just about 3 years away. So even now we're kind of behind the curveball in futuring concepts. So what we did was we normally look at societal trends, we look at cultural trends, we look at education, economy, government, and the political environment. We look at all of it through the lens of finding patterns. And through those patterns, then, we draw some implications. So they're not necessarily like, this is what will happen, more of this is what could happen, and we need to pay attention to that. So we looked at not just, and the truth is that most of the time when we're looking at patterns for 10 years out, not a lot of it is coming out of journals yet. It's mostly spearheaded by society and culture and some of these offshoot things we're seeing in the media. And a lot of what's happening with Generation starts as a marketing media buzz, and then all of a sudden it takes over, and then we pay attention to it. So what we're going to present to you today are some things that may resonate with you and you may already be seeing, but maybe haven't fully come into light yet. And so that's what's exciting about it. So we looked at things from U.S. News World Report to current trends in education to social media pages to a lot of businesses saying, giving input into what's happening in the workforce. And if you really want to have fun, how many of you guys have strategy or futuristic as part of your profile? Yeah? Or if you just really love to look at the what ifs, shapingtomorrow.com is a futurist website where you could type in practically any topic and they will pull up tons of trending articles from all around the world that will kind of give you insight into what happens. And they send out a newsletter and they'll bullet point it for you. So part of what stemmed the Generation Z was because I saw it on Shaping Tomorrow and it said, watch out, Generation Z is coming and implications. And I was like, oh great, I haven't figured out the Millennials yet. And here comes Z, right? So we're gonna have fun with this. So we're just a conversation. It's just to spark your thinking. It doesn't mean that we have drawn, a lot of factual conclusions as much as saying, what about this? And could this impact how we're actually interacting with our students? So with that, I want to just make sure that we understand what we're talking about in terms of generational differences. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about generational distribution, just in age range, to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we're going to talk about the similarities between Generation Y and Z, because there are actually distinct similarities, probably more than any other generation before. And then we're going to talk about the differences, because there are subtle differences between the two. And then draw some conclusions and have brainstorming here about what can we do now that can help to be prepared for the next 10 years of education. So with that, I just want to show you, Tappan Scott, he wrote this book, Tap Scott, Growing Up Digital, and it's how the net generation is changing your world. It's a great book. I found some really insightful things in here. He, depending on who you look at, the generational age range varies. I think I've seen it as much as like 5 or 10 years sometimes. But just so that we're on the same page for this, they describe the boomers, between 1946 and 64, so about 23% of the population. The Xers between 1965 and 76, so about 15%. Then a huge increase, larger than the boomers, is the millennial generation. Between 77 and 97. And then we see Generation Next, or Generation Z, which is about 13%. So it's almost equivalent to Generation X. Since it's still going, it could increase. I don't know how much. I haven't heard that projection. I haven't seen anything. There is some debate about Generation Z maybe being as far into the early 2000s. And so there's a little bit of a straddle there. So how many of you guys are boomers? All right. How about Xers? I'm like on a cusp. I'm on the cusp of Xers. And then millennials? Millennial? Okay, and then Zs. Okay, so the Zs right now are about. So knowing that context, we're going to hone on the millennials and Generation Z and go from there. Okay, so it's B.
Good afternoon. Nan said, my name is Gabby. I am a millennial. And so we would like to go through different similarities, or 3 key drivers of similarities between the Generation Y and Generation Z. So our first similarity is going to be information overload. In a world we grew up in, technology is everywhere. We wake up to our phones, we scroll through Instagram and Facebook to see what we missed out in the last 8 hours. We listen to the TV, the radio while we're getting ready for work. We get to work, we get to school, and we're on Google, we're on Yahoo, on Instagram. Information is being thrown at us consistently. So what this means, information overload, how it impacts your classroom and your students, is that information is no longer sacred. Professors no longer hold the keys to knowledge. Professors can't just share information, but they need to be intentional on how you share it with your students. For example, I particularly don't enjoy a 1-hour lecture on the different leadership styles when I can just Google it and see the different leadership styles out there. I enjoy applied projects, how we apply those different leadership styles to the different personalities within our classroom, in group discussion, in group work. These generations want to learn differently than the traditional lecture. Secondly, with the amount of resources and information available, it makes finding questions and answers, problem solving, so easy. We are no longer challenged to be creative. We're no longer challenged to critically think because we can type in a question into Google and there's going to be tons of pages with tons of different answers, opinions, and again, it's limiting the creative capacity of students. Finally, with all this information available to the different generations, we have a hard time deciding on who's authentic and who's fabricating. How often do students question, well, why can't we use Wikipedia? With the amount of information, again, it's hard to discern and decipher who's being authentic and who is fabricating. Second similarity we'd like to look at is speed, the rate of access in which we can gain information. Your everyday lives, you think that you can quickly Google a recipe for dinner, or you can look up the latest sports scores from last Sunday's games. Or even better, think about those of you who have children, how quickly they can send and receive text messages. It amazes my parents how quickly I can type out a paragraph. But this means in the classroom that the rate in which they can access information, we're seeing that these generations have shorter attention spans. Information taking too long to download frustrates them. They want the quick fixes. They want to just type it into Google and figure out what they need. In the classroom, we need to be aware of not just the material, but the delivery of the material. We want to reiterate the importance of interactive and engaging learning to hold those attention spans. Because we understand as professors, you want to be engaged. You don't want students falling asleep on you. You've worked hard to prepare for them. The rate of speed and which we can access information. Gen Z and Gen Y are lacking the ability to in-depth learn, it's crippling their ability to apply their learning to real-life examples, to no longer can problems or explore problems, they can just type it into Google and find the information. If a problem exists, there's probably already an answer out there. So the only way to slow down our generations is to really immerse them into hands-on experience, hands-on projects, hands-on learning. Through our Young Executive program, we actually did a lot of applied projects. We got to work for Kaiser Permanente, which was huge, and so again, it slowed us down. Thirdly, we'd like to look at the different multi-mediums in which these generations can access information. So not only is so much information available, the way in which we retrieve it, we have so many different options. YouTube, Google, iPads, iPhones, tablets, different multi-mediums by demonstrating the ways in which we like to learn. We like variety. There's now YouTube videos that can teach you French, that can teach you how to solve math problems. There are apps now that can help you learn French. They can help you record lectures in the classroom. All of this access is fantastic. However, it doesn't substitute for the non-technical learning skills. Again, the critical thinking, the problem solving, time management. We need to be aware. The variety of sources available for learning doesn't mask the need for experiential and applied learning. It is through those applied learning projects, those real life situations in which there's pressure put on you. You're forced to make decisions. And so again, just using, these generations are naturally collaborators, innovators. They want to use these resources that we're so good at using, internet, Facebook, technology, and integrating it into their classroom work. Finally, these different outlets of learning, these different outlets of resources also influences the decisions that your students are making. Social media is broadcasted everywhere. And so being aware that Instagram post about our applied project for Kaiser Permanente interested other friends of mine. Hey, what school do you go to? What program are you doing? That's amazing experience you're getting to add to your resume. So not only are you able to market your classroom, but market the university. I work in graduate admissions here, and so recruitment's kind of always on my mind. So it's a great tool just to be aware of, to not only market you as a professor, but what your students are doing in the classroom. Do you have any thoughts, comments, questions, concerns about these similarities we are seeing in the generations?
Okay, so now that we understand some of the overall similarities between the two generations, we wanted to draw some attention to some of these nuanced differences that Dr. Gilbert explained in the beginning. So the first thing we're looking at is how do the students actually engage with the information that they're learning or that they're encountering constantly throughout the day. So we've noticed that millennials tend to be passive consumers. Now this is not supposed to be a be-all, end-all, millennials only accept information constantly, but it's just this idea that as we've been growing up, we are learning, we're kind of adapting to this environment where information is coming at us constantly, and I feel like it's made us almost lazy, or we just accept things as they come. Whereas Gen Z, we're seeing this really interesting phenomenon where they challenge what they're seeing. They have been born into a world where they must think critically about all this information, or they at least have to decide how to sift through it. And so the first thing we wanted to talk about with the passive consumers and the millennials is just they tend to accept information and the existing structure. It's easy, they trust it, they've grown up with it. And then they're also accustomed to receiving information without really being required to interpret it. And I think that we can see some of these throughout the education system. If you just think about a typical lecture style or even how elementary education is set up, they hear information, they accept it, they believe it, they move on. Same thing just when we're thinking about the information overload that Gabby explained. We find information online, we accept it, we move on. Sometimes we don't challenge it as much as we need to. We've also seen that millennials maybe learn how to play the system. So this is an idea of getting really good at Googling things super fast, finding resources from a variety of places, which is very good, but just taking it, accepting it, applying it, moving on, filling in those check boxes. We have an assignment from a professor, we can get it done in a half hour because we know how to do that quickly. So the cool thing that we're seeing with Generation Z is they are challenging the system, and they expect this reciprocal communication. And so they may find something online, they'll actually engage with it, or they might talk to their peers online. They'll say, is this really true? Is this going on? And so it's kind of cool because we're seeing this almost like this morphing of them actually challenging. We also have seen that Generation Z tends to connect emotionally to causes and then they respond. So they don't just find the information and accept it, move on, maybe retweet. They actually connect emotionally, and then they're challenged to find an innovative way to solve it. And as Jillian described before, this is just kind of a foresight, a thing that we're seeing. It hasn't been definitively said by research, but there are a lot of really cool TED Talks. If you guys are interested later, try to find TED Talks done by 12 to 16-year-olds. You'll be amazed, some of these kids out there. I mean, they are really solving huge problems of the world. So now that we're seeing that Gen Z is, they're selective and discerning, and I really think that that comes from them being born into this environment of constant access. It's almost like it's so second nature to them that they've honed in on their abilities to take in information, which is a little different than the millennials. So the second difference that we want to talk about is talking about this question of how do the students engage with authority. Now, both generations have similar parents. If you think about parenting styles, the helicopter parent or attachment parenting, both generations grew up in this environment where they were nurtured, cultivated, and protected. But we're seeing a little bit of a difference with Generation Z in their expectations of parents or of authority role models. So with millennials, we see a need for direct instruction. Now, in our cohort, we experience this almost every day. We would get a new project, and if the professor tried to challenge us and say, interpret this, or just find a subject and explore, we'd say, well, what exactly are you looking for? What's your rubric? Do you have a checklist? Like, I need this, I need directions. And that is a big thing, and that prevents us from really exploring and innovating and challenging. And that's something that we've seen with millennials as well. Generation Z, on the other hand, their parents really focused on individualization, cultivation. So they were still in a protected environment, and that's some overlap with the millennials, but there was this kind of do-it-yourself mentality, or you can solve this problem. You can go online and use a new medium to figure this out. And so we found that they really value relationships with their parents, which translates into the classroom. They're seeking reciprocal relationships with their professors and with their peers. And we've also seen an underlying respect of authority and of institutions, which is really interesting. People are saying that Generation Z might be the new conservative, because even though they're questioning systems, they also have this inherent respect for them because of how they've been raised. So it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out. So the third difference that we're looking at is the question of what motivates the students and how do they define success in the classroom. Now, with this, we don't want to really focus on the kind of, they're only motivated by money or they're only motivated by this, but really more, what is the student looking for when they are coming through higher education? So we saw that millennials, although they are really influenced by kind of social issues and because of the access to information that Gabby talked about before, they want to find meaning. Work-life balance is a really big buzzword right now. It's more popular than ever before, but we're actually seeing Generation Z taking it to a whole nother level. Because they have seen some of their millennial older brothers and sisters go through the typical system. They're in clubs in high school, they graduate with a 4.0. They apply to a college, get in 4 years, they're in leadership activities, and then they graduate and they can't find a job. Maybe they're still living at home. It's redefining for Generation Z what is success, and it's making them question typical structures, and especially with higher education. And so we've also seen that both generations are inherently entrepreneurial. So that's what's really cool. If you look online, there are some really amazing things happening, and that especially, I think, is because of technology and because of how quickly ideas spread. You have to innovate to be different. And you can find all these different ideas online in 2 seconds, and then you can try to think, how can I fix this? How can I improve this? Share ideas, get feedback. But what we've seen the difference between millennials and Generation Z is Gen Z will take a good idea but beyond the traditional business plan to make money, and they'll actually engage their social network and try to make a huge impact. And so that is exactly what I was saying with the TED Talks. If you look those up, you'll see example after example of that, or even if you just Google spectacular Gen Z kids or anything like that. So now we're looking at Gen Zs as active consumers who seek mentorship and relationships. They're very independent and they like to do things their own way. They are experts at utilizing their social media and technology to innovate. So now we need to ask ourselves, as professionals in higher education, if they're building their own systems, if they're able to Google and get all this information at the touch of a button, and they're questioning the value of what we're doing here, how can we change? What can we offer them? And so that's what we're going to talk about next.
Okay, so we get so far, we're throwing lots of information, right? But by nod of head, are you noticing some of these in your classroom already? And I noticed that some of you here are in education, teacher education, so are you noticing that when you're going into high schools and elementary schools? Are we seeing some of these Gen Z characteristics? Yeah? A great example I think of is the ice bucket challenge, started by youth group originally, wasn't it? Or like some youth that were Gen Zers, and how fast, social cause, how rapid that happened. Really non-traditional ways of which they're trying to make a difference in the world. And that's really, really interesting to me. I have taught boomers, Xers, millennials, and Zs now, or I have a Z nephew and niece, and I'm trying to figure them out. They love me, which is good, so that I can get them to talk to me, but I really am noticing these subtle differences between how they are socially recognizing and reconciling their environment. And yet this technology thread is permanent now in all generations. It's not, like with the boomers and the Xers, we had pre-major technological advances. And now we're seeing that between the X and the Y, and I think as we keep going, there's going to be continual disruptive, very large technological advances that are just going to be normal. And so as we see that, we do have to look at what are some of the key drivers then, these patterns of speed, the patterns of technology being part of who they are, the social relationship piece, and all of these, I see them as ways in which they're trying to find their identity, right? They're their identity forming pieces. And the community and relationship and how they're responding to culture are really what we're talking about. And so even as we've had conversations about, on the university level, about how, the change between not just coming to get a degree, but actually has to have value to them, you can see that the Zs are going to want value. It's not going to be so much about that check marking is what I'm going to get in the classroom unique and valuable enough that is going to help me emotionally that I'll be emotionally connected to, in which I discover what my purpose will be in contributing to society. And I think all generations have that, but this generation, especially the end of this millennial generation and the coming of the Z, this is extremely important to them, the meaning and purpose. And it also ties to spirituality too. So it's like, this is a perfect place at APU to do that, because we can add in these other pieces. And because both generations struggle with some of that depth of learning and the critical evaluation, that's where people discover who they really are, that critical reflection and some of those deeper undertones. So it changes the conversation. Does that make sense? So we kind of said, how do we boil all this down into 3 key factors? If we could say anything about the classroom and the classroom environment, we came up with what we think are 3 key factors. And a lot of it comes out of Tapscott's book, because he articulates it so well. So why reinvent the wheel, right? So the first key factor is that relationship is everything. Really, when we're talking about relationship, we actually have to redefine our roles a bit. And I hope this makes sense. I was trying to figure out how to do it, and I couldn't visually figure it out. But we have to go from teacher and student to teacher-student, and where there's this reciprocal where I'm teaching and I'm learning, and my students are teaching and learning. And so it's not so much that I stand up and am the complete expert and I expect them as students to learn it, but that I have to redefine the relationship so much so that I hear something profound from a student and it causes me to learn. So that reciprocity, that is what we're seeing has been most profound. And honestly, that's why I call them my friends. Because I think we had some intense conversations, and it morphed into more than just content, because they want to tap into your bank of knowledge that can only happen when you're actually having a conversation and when you allow that relationship to exist. So how does that look? We gave some examples. More collaboration, collaborative activities where students are in relationship with each other and you're sitting down with them in relationship with them. So it also syllabus, how you're talking about your policies in your syllabus, how you're actually wording things will establish relationship with your students, and it may change the tone and tenor. But also more group or one-on-one mentoring and coaching. So for an example, I had the privilege of being able to be their instructor for the Kaiser Permanente project. And instead of trying to do these mass classroom discussions, met group by group weekly and just talked it out, heard their ideas, helped them explore it, and we ended up having much deeper meaning, and they got access to pieces of me that I would never share in class. Because we have all this stuff here, all of our life experience, all those other things. They get to know me, I get to know them, and I get to personalize the education. And out of that then comes opportunities for speaking into their personal lives and some of those deeper meaning things. So more group one-on-one coaching, mentoring opportunities. It actually is a lot of work on the front end, but a lot easier when you're in it. So you don't have to say, how do I fill 3 hours of time? It's like, okay, we're going to do this, and then we get to Rome, and we get to, so it can be really fun. Also, that students want to be a co-learner with you. So they know things that we don't know. And purely because they like to surf the web much more, and they like to be a part of that interactive. And so that co-learning element in the relationship is really huge. Does that make sense? Okay. So the second key factor is that pedagogy matters. I know we all know that. But more so today, our entire philosophy of how we craft our class, how we craft the assignments, how we craft the learning outcomes matters because this generation is receptive to the deeper meanings of what is behind the assignments. So even though they say, even the millennials saying, just tell me what to do and give me the rubric, there's a lot of value in grading rubrics and there's a lot of value in providing parameter, but at the same time, pushing them by not providing all of that is actually really healthy. So how are we pushing them by not providing it, but making ourselves available through the activities and through our relationships to help them discover it themselves? So really what we're seeing is that we have to reframe the learning experience so that they're discovering the capacity to learn. Less about walking out with knowing things as much as learning how to discover it and learn how to know. It's a subtle difference, but it's super important. So, you know, some people actually say tests, we shouldn't be doing tests anymore, and the truth is there's some technical skills we have to make sure that they understand and know, but it has to be supplemented with something else. The supplement should be how are we talking about that information and what do we do then now that we know it. And of course, like we said, the applied project-based where we actually kick them out the door and say, go try it, and I'm here if you need me, has profound effect because it connects with what they hear and see on the internet and see in the media and see with real life, which sometimes can be very different. And so then we can be there for them when they say, we tried and we epically failed, and you say, okay, well now why? This takes a lot of risk. I remember saying to this crew, I am putting my entire reputation on the line. KP is putting their entire reputation on the line here if this doesn't work. But we're going to do it together. And so pushing them and challenging them and letting them know they can find the answers and yet still having that support and guidance has proven to have a larger learning outcome. And I've seen it in other avenues too, even with simulations and even how we talk about case studies and interactions. But all of that's part of that. Are we good so far? Am I right? Okay. Okay, so the final key factor is instead of being afraid of technology, we need to take command of it. So I always struggle with what do I do with technology in the classroom? Do I tell them, don't have your laptop on because I just think you're going through Facebook? Or do I tell them to have it on and take the risk? You know, there's always this challenge with the cell phones and the chats and everything. But I think what we need to do is, and what we're seeing is we have to actually take command of it, take ownership of technology ourselves, and then find ways in which we can transform the classroom experience. Now, hear me say, you cannot just throw technology in and hope for a good outcome. You have to actually change your pedagogy and your relationship with the student, then with technology, create a more meaningful, multi-dimensional classroom experience. So this flipped classroom is actually genius. But what it requires is you to say, do I just record a lecture and put it online, or do I find another way to interact with them in this environment without me just talking to them? So that's something to think about. And it requires a transformation of pretty much our teaching philosophy too. Is if I'm going to do this, am I willing to stray from that and try something different? So an example would be Google Hangout. Maybe instead of, instead of office hours, which I know we're supposed to have office hours, but maybe you do Google Hangouts and you have them talk to you via Google, or maybe you are interacting with some sort of media and then talking about it, or you are having a conversational style prompting question online that they have to think about and come ready for class, versus it being that traditional just put your PowerPoints online and record a lecture. Sometimes that's not going to, they probably won't look at it. So it's not just throwing technology at the problem, it's the coupling of technology and our relationship change. Make sense? Okay. And the other, which I thought is interesting, I'm like, I don't know how I would do this, so I'm still processing this one. But they're saying use technology to develop relationships with your students. So I was like, how would that work? And I thought, well, Facebook page for the class, maybe. Or maybe finding ways to have them introduce themselves through creative media. or I don't know, but I think that's a really interesting point, is that you can actually use technology to get to know your students and for them to get to know you. And I'm processing what that looks like. I'm still trying to figure that one out. But I think it's a powerful thing to consider, that if they're so emotionally connected virtually, that they will want to be virtually connected with you virtually. So what I took from this was, okay, I have some work to do, that's fine. That really what they care about more than some of the traditional things I think I want them to learn, it's more of, I want them to know me and what I have to offer. I want them to understand the importance of the subject matter. And I want them to learn how to learn it. And if I can do that and craft an experience where they are asking each other and asking me, and actually that critical thinking, problem-solving component, if I can do that, then I think we'll walk away with really stronger critical learners for life. But that means that I have to transform some of my own perspectives about standing up in front and just talking. Maybe I can insert questions. Maybe I ask them questions or have them ask me questions, and I make it more of a conversation. So those are some of the factors. Do you have anything? Did I miss anything that we know? So that's, in a nutshell, what we have noticed our patterns and trends. And with the Z generation, I am thrilled, excited, and a little scared, because I think they are incredibly smart. As we know, the millennial generation is the smartest generation to come through because of their access to education. The Z generation is the most diverse population to ever come through our school system. Research is showing us that they are directed, they want to be a part of society, they want to be citizens of society, and yet they lack some critical thinking, depth, and maybe a little bit of self-awareness. And so really that's what education is, right? Developing that critical thinking and that self-awareness so that they can have that well-rounded piece. And that provides value, and that will provide meaning and purpose as we think about the next 10 years. So really, the millennials are on their way out. Maybe you got 4 more years with them. The millennials are having babies. So the millennials are now the parents of the future college students that you'll have. So we have about 3 years before it hits full force in college. So we have some time, and that's good. So I encourage you, I hope this was helpful in the bits and pieces, and I would love to hear your thoughts now, and we're going to have a brainstorming session, but are there any questions or thoughts, anything that resonates with you? Okay, we have the room for a little bit of time if you want to keep talking, but I want to pull us back together. Just to remind you that this is just the beginning of the discussion, and we don't have all the answers to what's going on because it's messy, because they're people, and I love that. And we haven't even talked about the power of God in transforming this experience as well, but that spiritual element that we bring, all of these are part of why this matters so much to us. So I just want to encourage you to keep having the conversation. Talk to CTLA, ITT. They can provide some great skills and tools, and if you want more workshops like this, tell them, that way we can engage in this together, because I'm sure all of you have experiences you can speak to, so there's nothing special about this except that we just thought it was interesting. But before we go, we're going to do a raffle. We have 2 books to give away. Make sure everybody is signed in, because we want to make sure we have record of that, but we're going to do a raffle, so if you have your tickets, we're going to pull them out, and there's 2 books, Millennials Go to College, which has been around for a long time. It's in a 2nd edition. And the other one was the one I referenced a lot, Growing Up Digital. And there's also a book coming out November 11th called The Z Effect. And when you put Z, Generation Z in Amazon, by the way, all you get is zombies for the first page, but you will get to it. It's funny. I was like, no, I wasn't talking about zombies. But anyways, it's a book. It's coming out. And it has a red front, and it's really, really a futurist perspective, but it's brilliant. I'm really excited to read it. So we're going to do that. So here we go.